Good afternoon. Welcome to HRPP's Research Matters. I'm Erica Salzik, the Department Administrator for UT Southwestern's Human Research Protection Program, and I will be one of the moderators for today's session. Let's go over our housekeeping. So if you have any questions for our presenters, please type them in the Q&A. One of the moderators will respond to you during the session, or we will address it at the end of the presentation. This session is recorded and will be available immediately after the conclusion of the live session by clicking on the Microsoft Teams Live link in the Outlook in the email. We will send the slides and handouts out via the listserv, and you will also be able to access upcoming Research Matters meeting links, slides, handouts, and previous recordings on HRPP's Research Matters website, which can be found under the Training and Resources page. We do provide a certificate of attendance for those who have logged in using a valid email address. If you do not receive one via email but should have, please send an email to hrpp@utsouthwestern.edu to request a certificate. And lastly, we want to hear from you. We are interested to know what topics you would like us to cover during these sessions. How did our speakers do, and how is our office doing? So please take a few minutes to complete the survey to provide feedback. You may access the survey using your phone via the QR code on the screen or your computer by selecting the link that will be dropped into the Q&A shortly. Here is the agenda for today. So today we have an update from Mayed Bird in the IRB office, and then we will jump into our feature presentation on demystifying reliance, which will be presented by Hen Nadeem and Brendan Paulman, and we will conclude with an open Q&A session. So, may I take it away?
Thank you, Erica. So I wanted to talk about one update and just one quick announcement. Back in sometime in August or maybe in September, the IRB office initiated a withdrawal process, and that was kind of for new studies and for modifications. Someone reached out to us with a concern related to new studies that happen to be clinical trials, and mentioned that some of those clinical trials, when we withdraw those clinical trial studies, that sometimes when we instruct investigators to submit a new study, that the Velos record may be lost, and all of the work that SPA's didn't put in on the Velos records with regard to coverage analysis, CTA, and all those things may be lost or may cause some confusion. So we've updated our withdrawal procedures. For new studies that are clinical trials, instead of completely withdrawing those studies, we're going to return those studies to draft state. And that's going to, again, allow you to answer all the queries that the IRB has, resubmit the study whenever all of the issues have been resolved. And then again, it's really to help avoid any work that's already happened within Velos and having to restart that record or having a mismatch of your Velos records with the IRB submission. For non-clinical trials, if studies are obviously not responded to in the timely fashion at the time or the deadline provided by the IRB, those will be withdrawn and you'll be required to resubmit those, submit a completely new study. Now, again, this is not to say this is hard and fast rules. Of course, if you've got some extenuating circumstances, please let us know. We're willing to work with you. And then the next, it's not really an update, it's really just an announcement. I want to share with you that the IRB still has some vacancies that we need to fill. On our expedited review team, we've got 3 regulatory analyst positions. And then on our full board team, we have 2 regulatory analyst positions. So both sets of regulatory analysts, they're going to be responsible for doing pre-reviews of submissions. So if you or you know of anybody that's interested, please feel free to share this information. Those are all the updates I have from the IRB, and I will turn things over to Hen Nadeem.
Thank you, Mayet. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hind Nadeem, Expedited Review Program Manager, and presenting with me today is Brendan Paulman, Senior Regulatory Analyst for the Expedited Review team as well. And we will be demystifying reliance. We will start with some Reliance 101 terminology, and we'll begin with SIRB. The S here, unfortunately, does not stand for simple. It means single IRB, where one IRB of record oversees the conduct of research activities to all participating sites. SIRB can also be referred to as the IRB of record, lead IRB, reviewing, or central IRB. Relying institutions is when a site agrees to rely on an external IRB to conduct regulatory review on behalf of the local site. And a reliance agreement is a formal written document between two or more sites that are engaged in human subjects research that allows the site to cede IRB review to an external IRB. Smart IRB is not actually a reviewing IRB entity, but it is a web-based agreement platform or an online reliance system that provides a master reliance agreement to participating sites. IREX or IRB Exchange is a document management system that uses Smart IRB for documentation of reliance agreements. And a point of contact, also known as a study manager or lead study coordinator, is a person who is generally responsible for being the primary contact for study-related information and mainly responsible for facilitation of communication between either the research study teams involved in the study or communications between IRB of record and the relying IRBs. And relying study teams are the study teams involved in a reliance study, and they are responsible to designate a single point of contact who will serve as the communication portal with the relying sites and the lead reviewing site. And last but not least, local context. It is the language that is required by UT Southwestern to be presented in an informed consent for studies reviewed by an external IRB. Local context language can include state, local, or institutional policy language that is required. So again, what is single IRB? It involves the use of one IRB of record for regulatory and ethical reviews for all sites participating in a multi-site study. The HRPP is made up of various parts as demonstrated in the screen. All these parts are, the main primary goal of them is to protect human subjects. So when we are ceding IRB review to other institution or a commercial IRB, the only piece we're giving away is the regulatory review piece and sometimes the HIPAA privacy review, depending on the agreement. So in other words, all components of HRPP review still applies when we are relying out, and it is our responsibility as a relying site to ensure that the other HRPP components are being fulfilled. Therefore, as a relying site, we will review and request, if applicable, COI review, ancillary committee reviews such as radiation, PRMC, performance site, clinical trials, and so on. So to sum it up, HRPP review must still take place at all participating or relying sites. So the terms of single IRB and reliance are often used interchangeably, but at UT Southwestern, we refer to SIRB when UT Southwestern is serving as the IRB of record for external sites. In that case, we are responsible for making regulatory determination. We work with relying sites to incorporate state and institutional requirements. And we use the term reliance to refer to studies where UT Southwestern relies on an external IRB for regulatory determination. Local study teams still needs to work with the UT Southwestern IRB office to confirm that state and institutional policies and other components of HRPP are fulfilled prior to study initiation. So why SIRB? Well, because it's mandated by the regulations, and the purpose of using SIRB is to encourage collaboration, reduce duplicate study submissions while streamlining review process, minimize the impact of multiple IRB reviews for the same protocol, enhance protection and promote reliability of study data. It can also be argued that SIRB reduces administrative burden, but we are not going to comment on that and decided to go with the meme instead. So what are the policies that mandates SIRB? NIH and Common Rule. In 2018 and 2020, the NIH and the Common Rule mandated the use of single IRB for all domestic cooperative research that is funded by the NIH for non-exempt research grants. And on September of last year, the FDA rolled out 2 proposed rules with the intent to partially harmonize with the Common Rule regulations. The proposed rules will be requiring the use of SIRB for FDA-regulated multi-site clinical trials. So the SIRB requirement will not only be mandated for NIH-funded studies and Common Rule studies, but also for FDA-regulated clinical trials. And the proposed date for the mandate is by the end of 2024. So exceptions for single IRB requirement. First is exempt research, and UT Southwestern follows this by not relying on an external IRB for exempt studies. Also, it's not required if the designated SIRB is unable to meet the needs of specific population, where local IRB is required by federal, tribal, or state laws, when research is conducted under career development, research training, or fellowship awards, and of course, if the institution is not engaged in research. So how can we determine that an institution is engaged in research? Institutions and employees are considered engaged when one of the following criteria are fulfilled for research purposes. If identifiable and private information or specimen are being collected, if data about subjects are being collected through intervention or interaction, if you're obtaining informed consent, or simply if the institution or the primary PI is the grant awardee. Just being the primary grant awardee engages the institution in research, even if all other related research activities are going to be carried out at an external site. So employees or organizations are not engaged in research, and they will not require a reliance agreement when they are providing commercial services such as lab services, providing information about the study for prospective subjects, but not obtaining informed consent, providing contact information to prospective subjects or obtain permission from subjects for the investigator to contact them, when they allow the use of their facilities for interaction by investigators of another institution, or simply if they're obtaining coded or de-identified data or specimens from another site. Now that the PI confirmed that they are engaged in research, the next step is to obtain an agreement. An agreement, an IAA, is a formal agreement between two IRBs from different, So the IAAs is an agreement between two IRBs or two different institutions that involves a specific research project. This agreement outlines the terms of cooperation, outlines the responsibilities of each IRB, and aims to streamline the review process while ensuring compliance with ethical and regulation standards. IAAs may cover a single study, multiple studies, a category of a study, or all human subject research conducted under the FWA or the Federal-Wide Assurance. These agreements provide the permission for the reviewing IRB to make regulatory determination on behalf of the relying site. But if an IAA is for a single study, reliance agreement or reliance documentation is not necessary. However, if an IAA exists for multiple groups of studies, then reliance documentation is required. So reliance documentation. After an IAA has been executed, a reliance agreement or reliance documentation is necessary. This documentation is signed by two IRBs, the relying IRB and the reviewing IRB. The reliance agreement documents the agreements of the institution to rely on the reviewing IRB for a single study and allow the reviewing IRB to collect information that is required for review. such as the responsibilities of the relying sites, the responsibilities of the lead PI, communication management plan, local context required language, and respective authorities. As a relying IRB, we need to determine if it's feasible for UT Southwestern to conduct the study. We will complete local context survey and institutional profile for UT Southwestern, make sure that the ancillary reviews are performed if required per the protocol, confirm that the study personnel have updated trainings, and COIs are disclosed and management plans are provided if applicable. We also need to confirm that the local context language was added to the consent form per state and local requirements, especially if there are vulnerable population are included. There are some other provisions that needs to be in place. Moving on to the study team's responsibilities, when we are relying on an external IRB, first, we ask to please let us know, submit a reliance request or schedule a reliance consult to inform the IRB that you want to see the IRB review to an external site. Make sure to add UT Southwestern local context to the consent template. The local context language can be found on our forms website. Work with the sponsor or the lead site point of contact to submit reliance documents to the IRB of record to get UT Southwestern site onboarded. Submit the study in EIRB for local IRB acknowledgement. Submit all modifications, annual updates, reportable event to the local IRB, UT Southwestern IRB, and the reviewing IRB. And now I'll turn it over to Brendan to explain the different types of IRBs and provide a breakdown for the reliance submission process.
All right. So now that you've had more of a high-level overview on what reliance is, we'll go into the operational aspects of utilizing an external IRB. There are several types of IRBs which UT Southwestern commonly relies on. These include commercial IRBs, such as Advarra or WCG, the IRBs at other universities and medical centers, and cooperative group IRBs, such as the NCI or the National Marrow Donor Program. Commercial IRBs are most often used when conducting industry-sponsored trials. They're also used when UT Southwestern has an institutional conflict of interest, such as a financial interest in an investigational product, which would preclude our IRB from making regulatory determinations. We have a master service agreement with Advarra and WCG, which means that UT Southwestern has already agreed to the terms of the reliance agreement with these IRBs. However, a reliance request is still required, and we still review each study on a case-by-case basis, and we'll provide an acknowledgement that we're willing to rely on the central IRB for a particular study. The reliance acknowledgement email will contain instructions on site submission, and the study team should work with the sponsor, CRO, or lead site to submit for site approval. UT Southwestern often collaborates with other medical centers and universities, and when appropriate, we will rely on these IRBs at these institutions. Each IRB has its own policies, and it's important to be familiar with the policies of the reviewing IRB, especially the policies regarding short-form consents, reportable events, and HIPAA waivers or authorizations. When you're working with the lead site to onboard UT Southwestern, there will often be a site information sheet that we will fill out that informs the lead site and the IRB of any UT Southwestern requirements which may apply for that study. Be sure to provide this in the reliance request. We will also provide the lead site with an institutional profile which provides general information about our policies. The consent template from the lead site is used, and the required UT Southwestern language will be added to the consent template from the lead site. This language is available on our forms page. Then after the reliance agreement is completed, the UT Southwestern study team will work with the lead site on submitting a modification to the reviewing IRB for site approval. The NCI CIRB is commonly used for cooperative group cancer studies, such as ECOG, Alliance, NRG, and COG. Unlike most studies where UT Southwestern is relying on an external IRB, these do not require a reliance request. For the consent form, the UT Southwestern local language has already been approved by the NCI-CIRB, and the consent does not need additional approval from the NCI-CIRB after the UT Southwestern specific language has been inserted. The approved NCI consent templates can't be altered in any way except to add the approved UT Southwestern local language. The NCI-CIRB does have mechanisms in which they can approve changes to the consent template on a case-by-case basis, but generally speaking, changes are not allowed to their consent template. UT Southwestern also has approval from the NCI-CIRB to use the UT Southwestern short form templates available on the HRPP website. Note that for any other study, these need to be submitted in a modification or reportable event prior to use. And also the NCI-CIRB does not serve as the privacy board, so a separate HIPAA authorization will be used, and HIPAA waivers will need to be requested from the UT Southwestern IRB using Form H. And now we'll go into the steps for relying on an external IRB. So as we previously mentioned, a reliance agreement is needed for any study where we will be utilizing an external IRB, and the reliance request is the first step in initiating that process. The reliance request can be submitted via REDCap form that is linked on the UT Southwestern HRPP website. The form will ask for some basic information about the study and to include any materials that the lead site or sponsor has provided, such as the protocol, template consent form, and the local context document. Once submitted, the IRB office will review the request and proceed with initiating a reliance agreement if it's appropriate. We recommend booking a consultation with one of the reliance analysts. However, this is not required. So while we serve as the IRB of record for several affiliated institutions, when relying on an external IRB, each affiliated institution needs a separate reliance agreement. Reliance request form will have an option to add the affiliated institutions which will be involved in the study. And when the reliance request is submitted, it's routed to the Research Administration Office for these institutions. Be sure to notify the sponsor or lead site of any affiliated institutions which will be participating so that they're aware that a separate reliance agreement is needed. The next step is to obtain site approval from the reviewing IRB. The site-specific language will need to be added to the consent by the UT Southwestern study team for Advara and institutional IRBs. For WCG, we have a checklist on the HRPP website, which can be filled out, and that gets submitted in WCG's online application. And then the UT Southwestern information will be added to the consent form by a WCG analyst. The consent form doesn't need to be reviewed by the UT Southwestern IRB office prior to submitting to the reviewing IRB. However, sometimes they'll want us to look at it and provide some acknowledgement that we've approved the language in the consent form prior to site submission. If the sponsor or lead site rejects any of the information that we've added to the consent form, please contact the UT Southwestern HRPP office. The lead site will often provide a local context form to collect site-specific information, and the UT Southwestern HRPP office will work with the study team to fill this out. Once the reliance agreement has been completed, the study team will work with the lead site or sponsor to submit to the reviewing IRB for site approval. When submitting for site approval, be sure to include any site-specific recruiting materials or translated documents or any site-specific patient-facing materials. The specific submission instructions for every IRB is different, so you'll have to work with the sponsor, CRO, or lead site to submit for site approval at the external IRB. So all studies where we're relying on an external IRB still require a new study application and EIRB. So note that this is not a second IRB review, and we're not making any regulatory determinations. This is an administrative review to ensure that the submitted documents contain the required local context language, study team is up to date, and so we can determine, or study team training is up to date, and so we can determine whether ancillary committee reviews are needed, such as PRMC or radiation safety, et cetera. Remember the graphic earlier in the presentation. While regulatory review is ceded to the reviewing IRB, there are still functions that are retained by UT Southwestern, which require this information to be submitted. So answering yes to sections 5.3 and 5.4 will populate the Reliance sections in the SMART form. All documents will be utilized at UT Southwestern, including the consent forms, recruitment materials, patient-facing materials, investigator brochures should be provided in the EIRB submission, and be sure to include the approval letters from the reviewing IRB for all the documents. So the terms of the Reliance agreement will dictate whether the reviewing IRB or UT Southwestern will serve as the privacy board for the study. And the privacy board will be responsible for issuing HIPAA waivers. In most cases, when we're relying on a commercial or institutional IRB, the reviewing IRB will also be the privacy board, but there are a few exceptions for this. When the external IRB is serving as the privacy board, they must make all HIPAA determinations and issue all HIPAA waivers. A HIPAA waiver cannot be requested using Form H, and this must be requested from the reviewing IRB using their process. And this will vary from amongst various IRBs. Sometimes the waiver they issue with the initial study approval will cover all the relying sites, and then sometimes they'll grant HIPAA waivers on a site-by-site basis. So you would just have to work with the sponsor or lead site to determine that. In this case, the HIPAA authorization language will also be embedded into the consent template provided by the lead site or sponsor. When UT Southwestern is the privacy board, all HIPAA waivers will need to be requested from the UT Southwestern IRB using Form H. A separate HIPAA authorization or Form F will be used. This will apply to all NCI CIRB studies and certain studies reviewed by external IRBs where the reviewing IRB has not agreed to serve as the privacy board. Once the study is submitted in EIRB, it is administratively reviewed by the UT Southwestern IRB office, where we check for items such as city training, conflicts of interest, the site recruitment plan, recruitment materials. Performance site review and ancillary committee review, such as PRMC, biosafety, radiation safety, are also performed at this time. UT Southwestern IRB office will accept the review of the external IRB, and once performance site review, coverage analysis, and the clinical trial agreement, if these are applicable, are completed, the study can be activated and enrollment can begin. For the expiration dates in EIRB, we set the expiration date to be 30 days after the expiration date set by the IRB of record. And we do this so you have enough time to submit the annual update after the continuing review is completed by the IRB of record. So any changes to the study that affect the local site must be submitted to EIRB as a modification. This would include any protocol amendments, changes to the consent, any new or revised recruitment materials, or a revised investigator's brochure or device manual. These changes must be approved by the reviewing IRB prior to being submitted in EIRB. The approval letter for the modification from the reviewing IRB must be included in the EIRB modification as well. There are a few exceptions to this where the modification would not require approval from the reviewing IRB. This would include changes to study personnel, changes to Form C, and HIPAA waivers or an updated HIPAA authorization form if UT Southwestern is serving as the privacy board. For studies using an external IRB, we require an annual update to be submitted in EIRB. As mentioned earlier, the expiration date in EIRB is set 30 days after the expiration date set by the reviewing IRB, so you have plenty of time to submit the annual update. Be sure to include the approval letters for the continuing review from the reviewing IRB, and don't submit the annual update until the external IRB has approved the continuing review. In some cases, under the revised common rule, expedited studies may not have an expiration date, or the reviewing IRB might set the expiration date for more than 1 year in the future. Oftentimes it might be 3 years or 5 years. In this case, the expiration date in EIRB is set to the anniversary of the approval date, and then the annual update will need to be submitted with documentation from the reviewing IRB that the study is not expiring. And typically this documentation can be found in the initial approval letter. Relying on an external IRB, the local PI is still responsible for submitting reportable events to the reviewing IRB and UT Southwestern HRPP. It's important for the investigator and study team to be familiar with the reporting policies of the reviewing IRB. In addition to reporting to the external IRB, the below local events also need to be submitted to UT Southwestern HRPP, and this includes locally occurring emergency deviations, events that appear to constitute protocol violations or serious or continuing noncompliance, UPERSOs, and research-related complaints affecting subjects' rights, safety, or welfare. All locally occurring events which meet the reportable event criteria must be reported to the reviewing IRB and UT Southwestern within 5 business days of discovery. And the external IRB's response or determination to these events must be submitted to UT Southwestern HRPP within 10 business days of receipt. Next, we have a couple common questions that we get regarding reliance. So the study's already been approved by the central IRB. Why does it need to be approved again at UT Southwestern? So while the central IRB reviews the study and they make the regulatory determinations, UT Southwestern retains some of the responsibilities of the HRPP program. And we perform an administrative review to ensure that local policy is still being followed. So this is not a second IRB review. We review the consent form to ensure that the appropriate local language has been added. And we want to maintain a shadow record of what the reviewing IRB has approved. And there may be other local reviews, like I mentioned earlier, like PRMC, biosafety, radiation safety. How do I add a non-English short form for a reliance study? So for a reliance study, you want to use the approved short form consent from the lead site or IRB of record. If necessary, obtain approval from the IRB of record to use that short form. This will really just depend on the IRB that you're relying on. Everyone has a different policy regarding this, so it's important to work with the IRB of record and the lead study team to figure out if you need to obtain a separate approval to use the short form for the study, and then submit a modification in EIRB to use the short form consent. And then for NCI-CIRB studies, we actually have approval to use the UT Southwestern short forms, but these still must be submitted in EIRB. And what's the best time to submit a reliance request? So as soon as you receive the protocol and the study's been approved by the central IRB, you should submit the reliance request and notify us that you have a study that you want to rely on an external IRB for. A few resources if you have any additional questions. As many of you know, we have open office hours every Tuesday and Thursday from 10 to 11. And then feel free to contact the SIRB inbox for any questions regarding reliance. And of course, you can book consultation with a reliance analyst on the UT Southwestern HRPP website.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Hens. So this does conclude the presentations, and we're now going to move into our open Q&A session. I invite you to submit any questions or comments that you have at this time. And so I'm just going to pause for a few seconds to allow you some time to type up those questions. Okay, so I do see some questions coming in, so I'm going to kind of spotlight Brendan, Hen, perhaps Mayed. So the first question I see here is a translated Form F required for non-English / Spanish short forms?
So we do have a translated Form F on our website for Spanish-speaking participants, but other languages, Form F is not required. It's covered under the Form HS, HS, which is a HIPAA alteration. So it can be provided in the same manner as the consent using a translation services.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. So how can we tell if there are PRMC forms required to be submitted along with a modification?
So if the modification meets the requirement for a major change, that includes changing in the study procedures, increasing risk, that will meet the criteria for major change, and PRMC review will be required. So we will notify PRMC, and then the study team needs to fill out the PRMC forms in order for the mod to be assigned to a PRMC reviewer or go to a PRMC board.
Okay, thank you, Hend.
I'll add to that too, that oftentimes so changes in inclusion/exclusion criteria, changes to the primary or secondary objectives, and changes in local target enrollment also typically trigger PRMC review.
And
Okay.
I'll add one more thing, Erica.
Yeah, please.
Folks can also reach out to PRMC and consult with their office just to see, if this particular change requires PRMC review as well.
Okay, great. It's good to know. Okay, so I have someone who's going to be working on a new study using Sterling CIRB. Are we familiar with Sterling CIRB?
Yes, we have a couple of studies with Sterling.
Okay, great. Okay, so generally, when do we know when Form B is updated for chart review studies, for Reliance IRB, and single IRB?
So Form B is usually updated at the time of CR or annual update. When we added the add remove personnel function, we no longer require Form B to be updated in a modification unless it's a PI change. This is the only time when we will require Form B to be updated through a mod.
Okay, thank you. I'll wait just a few more minutes to see if that spurred anyone else to ask a question. And so while we do wait for you to get them type up, I just want to remind you of the survey. If you can just spend a few minutes to complete the questions, we will use the information to improve the content of these sessions and how we present them. And we will also be able to see what areas we need to work on in the office and what areas we are excelling in. And so I still do not see any other questions, but as always, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. And I'm just going to go ahead and conclude. So I want to thank our presenters, Hend and Brendan. Thank you all for attending today's session. Our next Research Matters session is scheduled in January 2024. That's January 16th. Have a great rest of your week.